Okay, we're back. Part 2. I hope you guys got a chance to look over the notes, and we're going to be going through those here in a second. We're going to look at Chapter 1. Last week we looked at Chapter 1, and we talked about how, number one, plants are not the same as animals and humans, so don't worship them, people. The rocks don't have life, and the trees are not people, just in case you were going down that road. And then we also looked at some repeated terms. We looked at the words good. We looked at how that was repeated, and then there were times when it was not repeated. We looked at the days of creation to specifically look at what the text said was created on that day. We noted that there are words in Hebrew for sun and moon, but Moses chose to use greater and lesser light. And we pointed out the significance that sometimes we read into the text before we give the text a chance to say to us what it's actually trying to say. For example, greater, lesser light, when we automatically jump to sun and moon, why didn't the author use sun and moon? Because there was a word in Hebrew for that. Let's see, we looked at plants, animals. We looked at the word yam. I'm a big proponent of a 24-hour literal period of time. It's qualified with evening and morning. It's qualified with a number. And repetitively throughout the Old Testament, when it's qualified with evening and morning, when it's qualified with a number, it means one 24-hour literal period of time. There's a great conversation going on right now on our Facebook page. Check that out. I love open conversation, and thanks, Dave, for that. So, no, enjoy it. Jump on that. I'd love to see some more comments and posts on that, see what you all think, and get you to weigh in on that. So appreciate Dave and your honesty and just jumping out there and getting on Facebook with that. So we're going to jump back to Genesis 1 in so much that I want to look at a few terms that I feel like we didn't get a chance to look at, and that sheet, the terminology, word, phrase sheet that you have goes along with that. Verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God, we talked about how in Canaanite language, the Canaanites, their God was El, and how in Genesis chapter 1, Moses chose to use the word Elohim instead of El, instead of God. He chose to use the word supreme or almighty God. That's what Elohim means. So it was very clear from the beginning that he wanted the Israelites to understand that their God was a supreme God, the supreme God. He also did not begin to defend God. It was just, in the beginning, God. This is not a defense of whether God exists. He does, and he was the one that created. In the beginning, God created. That word is bara in Hebrew. It is B-A-R-A on your sheet, bara. This word is used repetitively throughout the Old Testament, quite a few times. It is only used of God. Very interesting that this word is only used of God. The word means to create something from nothing, or to create something new from something that previously did not exist, or the initiation of something new. So we see from the beginning that God created. He created barad, something that did not exist prior. He brought something new into existence, bara. He created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrews did not have a word for universe. So when we see this term, heavens and earth, used together, it is the all-encompassing, total summation of the creative work. The heavens and the earth, the universe, they didn't have a word for it, and so it was basically everything. That's kind of what the heavens and earth, when they used that, that's what it was signifying. He created everything. The word earth, I believe, is on your sheet there as well. Eretz is how we pronounce that, and it just basically means, let's see if I put that on your sheet. Give me 1 second to look. Did I put that on there? Does not look like I did. There it is, Eretz, yes. So heavens and earth. So he creates the heavens and earth, the summation, the totalness of the universe. I see verse 2 is then a descriptive of the Eretz, the earth. So he begins then in verse 2 to describe, okay, God created, and now here's the state of it. It is formless and void. and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Formless and void. Stop right there. Getting ahead of myself here. So we have this word bara that's used of God and only God to create something that was not prior in existence, to create it and bring it into existence. There's another word that we see, it's most often translated made or to make, and that is the word asa, A-S-A, on your sheet. That is used both of man and of God, and it is to create or to design something from pre-existing materials. So, for example, the Hebrews would say, I made this building, or I made this statue. They didn't make it with something that didn't exist. They used pre-existing materials, brick, mortar, stone, wood, whatever, to make that building or statue or painting or whatever they were making. So, asa. There's another word we see it later on in Genesis 11:4, and that is the word bana, B-A-N-A, banana, to build. And we see that one, Genesis 11:4, they're building a Tower of Babel, so bana. So the earth is formless and void, tohu wabohu, that is on your sheet, tohu wabohu. Formless and void, it is, another way of saying that is lifeless and unlivable. So it is lifeless and unlivable, it is unformed, and it is unfilled. So there is no formation, it's just in a chaotic state. It is not able to be filled with anything, and it is not filled with anything. So it is formless and void. Our next statement is that darkness was over. That word darkness is koshek. The dark is a good translation of that, darkness. The dark was over the surface of the deep. The word deep is tahom, and it is deep, depths, abyss. We don't know exactly what that is, but we do know that as the text continues, it says, and the Spirit of God was moving or fluttering over the surface of the waters. We find that word waters. So there's this deep, unformed, unfilled state of a watery something. That is the current state of the earth at this point in creation. It's interesting here to note that in both Canaanite, Egyptian, Babylonian, and quite a few other ancient religions and belief systems, that they all believed or saw water, and they would use words like deep or chaos, basically, to describe this water, the state of this water. They believed it was the first substance. So even though they obviously didn't believe in God, they, in their religious systems and beliefs, believed that water was the first element. And the difference, or where they broke away from the Israelites in their belief on this, is they believed that out of that water, that chaotic state of this watery substance, that's where the gods came from. So if you keep that in mind, the culture that they're going into and that they came from, it's pretty interesting to note, because the culture they came from, the culture they're going into, the ones that they were going to have to deal with, are now through Genesis being torn down, and Moses is basically saying, no. The gods did not come out of that watery deep, that chaos that was the first element. That first element was created by God, a supreme God, the supreme God. So immediately in Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:2, we see a complete teardown of the Egyptian, Canaanite, Babylonian belief systems from their very foundation. So it's pretty interesting. So we have the earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. This deep, chaotic state that had some water to it. And it says the Spirit of God was moving. That word moving is the idea is fluttering. The idea of like a mother hen brooding is a good translation of that as well. over that, controlling it, protecting it, keeping it together. Interesting word as well. And then we see in verse 3, again, the beginning of the formation on that first day of that earth, of that chaos. So I wanted to jump over that real quick and give you some important key terms for your benefit in your study. Let's jump down to verse 26. I wanted to spend a little more time on this. We did look at plants last week. We said that plants are not the same. They don't have life. They don't have the lifeblood. They're not the same as humans. We see that in contrast to the video that we watched, humorous and scary at the same time, of people who believe that plants have a life to them, and we should treat them as humans and value them as humans. God would say no, and the reason he would say no is in his created order, day 5 and verse 26. It says, and then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. We see these verses here as the glaring difference as to what sets us apart from plants and what sets us apart from animals, because we see here that we are now to rule over animals and have dominion over them. Interesting, I believe it was Ginger brought up the us and the are. We see this thing that we call the Trinity, this theological truth about God. From the very beginning, let us, it's repeated 3 times, us, are, and are, so there's 3 times is mentioned. In these verses also the word image is repeated 3 times, and then also the fact that God created takes place 3 times. Again, this would fly completely counterculture to the idea of evolution, where we came from something. No, Genesis is saying God created us. So again, this is flying in the face of all that as well. Speaking of flying in the face of, again, if you look through all of the things that God created and is mentioned, light, sky, animals, all this stuff, all of these are in Canaanite and Egyptian, again, in their beliefs, all of these things are things that embody gods. Baal, the god of rain, Ra in Egypt, the god of the sun. Horus, I believe, is seen as I think it was either a jackal or a falcon of some sort. So you see all these gods in Egyptian and Canaanite belief systems are related to or directly tied to a created element. And so what Genesis is doing, I mean, obviously it's tearing that completely down and saying none of these gods matter. These things that you're worshiping, like the sun, are all just created by a supreme God. So, okay, don't want to dwell on that too much more here. So we see this word image repeated 3 times. Image basically is the word tselem, T-S-E-L-E-M, is transliterated. I put that on your terminology sheet. The word image means resemblance, a phantom image, or a representation from. Let me take a sip here. A representative figure is the word image. The word likeness is also used for defining how God created us, and that is the word demut, D-E-M-U-T. And likeness is the original after which a thing is patterned. So there's original, and then there's a thing that is patterned after that original. God obviously being the original. This is seen as, or can be summarized by 3 terms: personality, or the intellect, emotion, and will. These are things that we have that animals do not have in the same way that we do. Intellect, emotion, and will. They involve the spiritual life, ethical life. Animals cannot make ethical choices. That we have moral sensitivities. morality is an issue with us because we were designed that way. We have a conscience, and we have the capacity to represent God. This is something animals and plants cannot do. We have the capacity to represent God, not them. They might reflect an awesome creator God who created something beautiful, but we have the capacity to go about the world representing God and speaking of Him. So, because of this, you can say that we have great responsibility. We have a huge responsibility because of being created in the image of God. A couple other things to note, too. We can produce a living soul. We will see here in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. 2 verse 7, it says, "Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being," or a living soul. It's interesting that it says, "and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life." That word life is actually plural in the original Hebrew, so better translated, the breath of lives was breathed into man, the original man. You and me were breathed into him. Gives us a better understanding of the fact that in Adam's sin, he was the representation, and all of our seed was in him. So because of his sin, it affects us all. Breathed into him the breath of lives. So man is able to produce a living soul. We are to have dominion because of being created in the image of God. This word dominion is used a few times, and it has the idea of putting down opposition, which is interesting to note because at this point we don't have sin, so it's almost like a foreshadowing of the opposition that we would have to put down. So man is to have dominion and put down opposition, and that has both a physical and a spiritual aspect to it. That word does. And we also see the word rule, which we will go into a little bit later on. But I wanted to talk about that because I wanted to point out image and spend a little bit more time on that as we realize that we are different than the rest of creation because we're humans and we were created in the image of God. This concludes part 2. We're going to jump into chapter 2 now in part 3.